One day, several years after Victor and I had left for Houston, we came back home to stay with my parents for the weekend, and my mother proudly announced that San Angelo now had some new coffee place everyone was talking about. We drove up to see what I expected to be some rural cowboy coffee shop, but instead a Starbucks stood largely on the corner, looking wrong and out of place, next to the shops that hadn't changed since I was a kid. "Oh, thank Christ," Victor said. "Civilization comes to West Texas at last," he proclaimed. It bothered me. Not that Victor equated caramel macchiatos with civilization, but that there had been a turning point, a final tip over the edge, when I realized that the small town I'd always expected to come back to no longer remained, at least not in the same way as before. Later that night, I sat out on the porch looking at the same stars I'd stared at when I was 10 and had longed to travel to places that existed only in my mind. They were places like Egypt or France, but they were the Egypt and France of a child's mind, filled with blurry visions of perfect pyramids, warm sands, and Eiffel Towers, and something that people called wine. They were visions of places that weren't quite real, but that was long before I discovered that the romanticized places on the map were more than just pretty pictures, and that included things I couldn't have even imagined when I was young. Things like political unrest and dysentery and hangovers. That night I looked up at those same stars, but I didn't want any of those things. I didn't want Egypt or France or far-flung destinations. I just wanted to go back to my life from childhood, just to visit it and to touch it and to convince myself that, yes, it had been real. Victor could tell I was upset, but I couldn't find a way to describe it without sounding ridiculous. "It's nothing," I said. "It's just that... Have you ever been homesick for some place that doesn't actually exist anymore? Some place that only exists in your mind?" He rocked with me on the front porch in silence, not knowing how to answer. And eventually he put his arm around me and told me everything would be all right. And then he went inside to get some sleep. He found me the next morning, still outside in the same rocking chair, and stared at me worriedly. He asked me gently, "Are you going to be ready to go home this morning?" I rocked in silence and realized for the first time that home wasn't this place anymore. It was wherever Victor was. It was both a terrifying and enlightening realization. And I took a deep breath and thought carefully before I answered. "Yes, I'm ready to go home." It was like saying hello and goodbye at the same time. And Victor stared out at the baseball field that had once been a cotton field. He quietly said, as if to himself, that the memories of the places we'd been before were always more golden tinted in retrospect than they had ever been at the time. And I nodded, surprised that he'd known more than he'd let on. He was right, but I didn't know if that made it better or worse. Was it worse to be homesick for a time that was once home, but now lived only in your mind? Or to be homesick for a place that never really existed at all? I couldn't answer, so instead I went back inside the house to pack for home.